So my name is Alexandria Reid. I am a research analyst in the Organised Crime and Policing team at RUSI. For those of you who haven't attended a RUSI event before, welcome. We are the UK's oldest defence and security think tank, established in 1831. And despite the word royal, we are an independent research institute. We don't have any affiliation with government, and we are based on Whitehall, with offices in Brussels and Nairobi too. This event is being co-hosted with my colleagues in RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, or CFCS, as it's better known. And together with my colleagues in that team, Anton Moishenko and Isabella Chase, I'm currently engaged in a 2-year study looking at how we assess the integrity of free trade zones, drawing on case studies in Panama, Morocco, the UAE, Singapore, and Malaysia. And as part of that work, we're publishing a long-form RUSI report, as well as producing a practical manual for the assessment of risk exposure in free trade zones. And so when Boris Johnson announced his plans to establish UK Freeports in his maiden speech as PM, and it became such a cornerstone of the Conservative Party's manifesto in the election, we knew that we would have a lot to contribute as an institute about how the UK could go around securing incoming freeports and what they could learn from the experiences of other countries too. Those of you who have been closely following this topic will know that the consultation document issued by the government in February of this year has provided the clearest snapshot to date about their early vision for freeports, and definitely shows evidence that there is an awareness that there are illicit trade and money laundering risks, as well as potential economic benefits. And I think what's probably most notable about that document is the fact that it clarifies that UK freeports won't be sites for high value luxury storage, but rather areas that will encourage manufacturing, processing, and transshipment activities. If you're interested in our work on the details of the consultation paper, you can find a useful, short, very accessible digest. It's our recent briefing paper called Freeports, Not Safe Havens, and that's online at the rusi.org website. However, the good news is that I don't need to say much more about the topic myself, as I know that we're all in very safe hands with our expert panel today. First up, we'll hear from Richard Valentine, who joined the British Ports Association in 2007 and became its chief executive and director in 2016. He sits on the executive committee of the European Seaports Organisation, as well as Maritime UK Board. Prior to the British Ports Association, he was an MP's researcher in the House of Commons and spent 5 years at a Westminster political consultancy, so used to the introduction of new policies, no less. Richard will be followed by Dr. Clay Fuller, who is a prolific expert in this topic for those of you who know him already. Clay is a former inaugural Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, DC. He's testified twice to the US Senate on issues around beneficial ownership. He's published dozens of articles on this topic, including at least one for RUSI, and is well known for his major foreign policy report titled Dismantling the Authoritarian Corruption Nexus. Clay will be followed by Irene Meir, who is the Global Editorial Director of Thought Leadership at The Economist Group. So I'm sure that we have all had our views shaped by her in one form or another, whether we know it or not. Irene was previously the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at The Economist Intelligence Unit. And before that, she worked at the Centre for Global Competitiveness and Performance at the World Economic Forum, which couldn't be more relevant in the context of free trade zones. So without further ado, I will now turn to Richard, who will kick us off with his presentation.
Well, thank you very much for that, and welcome to everyone. I send my best wishes in this slightly kind of unusual time, slightly amazing times. But I think, as we've just said at the introduction, I think everybody is mastering the technology and we're getting used to these kind of things. So 300 people registering, I think, is absolutely brilliant. And I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you and possibly some debate after my short presentation. So just very quickly, I'll say British Ports Association. What are we? We're a trade association for UK ports. There's some numbers and figures which I always call our propaganda on the final slide with my contact details, so I won't give you all that yet. But our main focus in life is to represent the views of the UK ports industry to all parts of UK government and beyond. And as you can imagine, we have a very interesting, a strong interest in Freeports. This is something that we've been kind of looking at for many years. And indeed, as an independent ports industry, which is fairly unique in the world, in the UK, where effectively a lot of the big ports were privatised in the late 80s and early 1990s, we have a unique position, I would guess, looking at these kind of things, and having various proposals and issues and sort of government regulations imposed on ports over the years has somewhat focused the attention. So I'll move quickly on into where we're coming from on Freeports, though. So effectively, that's the context for us, where we are as an association. So we're lobbying, we're pushing for better regulation, improved rules and arrangements at ports. And one of the things we've been looking at for some time is port zoning. And this is effectively where you provide a zone where a port can thrive and develop and grow, where not just the Port Authority, but the tenants, the landlords, associated clustered businesses can grow and develop themselves. And ports in the UK are usually in areas of high deprivation, in coastal areas that could do with a bit of help. So we see ports as a bit of a hub for growing economic activity, jobs, etc. And of course, we've seen in the last few years that Brexit has focused the attention on certain types of ports, particularly roll-on, roll-off ports that facilitate, in our case, tens of thousands of lorry movements between the UK and the European Union each day. And so looking at what that means from a sort of operational perspective has focused the mind, but it's also focused the attention of policymakers on perhaps the role that ports play and potential opportunities there may be. So we have been, as you would imagine, we've been lobbying and talking to government about some of the operational challenges of Brexit to do with customs controls and other types of checks, but also we've been looking at some of the opportunities that may arise from leaving the European Union. And alongside this, our push on port zoning and those zones around ports has effectively found a bit of interest, we think, in government. I can't take sole responsibility because it's been a bit of a team effort from the ports industry, but it's been a big thing that the BPA has been pushing for some time, but not necessarily the traditional customs free trade area, which I have to say that under the UK's HMRC, the Revenue and Customs in the UK, you can achieve a lot of easements that are available to traditional customs free ports through various kind of provisions and points that are available from the HMRC. So it's more broad, our issues. And there has been a lot of UK port frustration over the years with things like planning rules and getting consents, and particularly things like marine consents for new developments or even ongoing developments has become quite challenging. And we do understand the concerns of environmental regulators and stakeholders, but essentially we found a lot of our members have found it quite frustrating, I have to say, dealing with these processes. And also we're a little bit as an independent port sector, largely private sector, as I said, we're a little bit sort of away from government decisions on transport infrastructure spending. And we're not quite the same as, say, the aviation sector, where passengers are moving through airports and railway stations, etc. So with freight, it's not quite got the same attention. But again, and finally, just before I move on to the next slide, it's very much about driving coastal growth is where we're coming from. And if you have a strong port and a coastal cluster, then you have jobs, etc. And on the right, there's a little picture there of a brochure we did last year with some other industry partners, looking at port zones and port zoning, which you can find on the BPA's website, which you'll see a link to later, which identifies where we're still coming from. Not traditional sort of customs-free Freeports, although that is very much part of it, but a wider package of offers. So just moving on to where we're coming from on the planning and enterprise zone front. We're looking at improved road and rail connectivity, as I mentioned, fast-track planning measures, perhaps expanding and improving permitted development rights with higher thresholds and perhaps a bit more kind of flexibility in line with the aviation sector, the airport sector. With zonal planning, perhaps linking in port master plans into regional transport bodies and local planning authorities so that they have a full understanding about what port strategies are. And essentially, unlike other businesses, ports are fairly unique in that they're not going to move. You know, they're geographically tied to an area. So they do have an interest, a vested interest in that region. So unlike other businesses that can pretty much up sticks and go anywhere they choose, the ports are there and they're there for good, hopefully, unless something serious happens and they close, etc. So the ports do have a bit more, you can trust them a bit more than other businesses, I suppose. And I don't mean that from a sort of legal point of view, but I mean from a strategic point of view. They do have a vested interest in staying somewhere and improving areas and flourishing as businesses. So just moving on, as well as those sort of planning easements, yes, I did mention the customs elements, and there are lots of opportunities there, which I think some of the other panelists will highlight some of the challenges around. So perhaps we'll come back to that in the Q&A. But just a final point on what a UK Freeport model might look like potentially, and what we've been interested in developing is the use of technology and digital presential links between various free ports and free trade areas to ease trade and to spread the benefits more. We did mention at the beginning, Alex mentioned the consultation that was launched, the government's policy announcement last year, and alongside that, a new government consultation was published in February, which has now been extended to July, and we expect with various processes further announcements on bidding to be later in the year, alongside a possible financial statement in the autumn, and then potentially with some legal tweaks next year and full designation in 2022. The significant thing for us is that it potentially would be 10 free ports, which is rather divisive for our sector because we do have over 120 cargo handling port areas and many others who specialise in servicing offshore activities and different types of industries such as the energy sector. So the limit to 10 is probably our one big reservation, I would have to say, and that'll be something we put in our consultation response. And then finally, I think that's probably me on time, but finally that's just a bit of the information about the British Port Association. If you want further details, my contact details are in the bottom left-hand corner. So that's enough for me. We do have time for questions afterwards, but initially I'm handing over to the next panellist, Clay Fuller, and Clay, I have jotted this down in case I got it wrong. Clay has several hats, but today he's wearing his Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime hat, which I think tells you a little bit about where he's going to come from when he talks about UK Freeports. So thank you very much from me, and I will stick around for questions afterwards, but over to Clay, our next speaker.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, I do wear several different hats. So I was previously at the American Enterprise Institute, where for the past 2 years, I've been doing a lot of policy work based essentially on strengthening transatlantic relationships and relationships between democratic states all around the world. That's including Australia, Japan, all the different free countries of the world, India, etc. So that's the policy work I've been doing, but I also do academic work, which I'm beaming in from beautiful South Carolina right now, where I'm beginning to do work with the Walker Institute at the University of South Carolina to pick back up my academic work, and where my heart is really on studying special economic zones, studying how they're used around the world and collecting data on them specifically. So you can find a lot more information about what I do and what I've been up to at my personal website, which is on the slide here, clayarfuller.com. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that. Oh, wrong button. Okay, so 4 main points that I'd like to get across in this very short talk about free ports and free zones. I'm going to take a much broader sort of perspective on this because I look at it around the world. So with the World Trade Organization forecasting that global trade is supposed to decline between 13 and 32% this year. And at the same time, the World Health Organization is saying that global trade is absolutely necessary to fight the coronavirus pandemic, to get the medical supplies that we need where they are needed around the world in a timely fashion. We need trade to be open. At the same time, it's declining. What I want to point out is that free ports, foreign trade zones, free trade zones, special economic zones, which are all basically the same thing, are at every single node of those global supply chains. And so they are critically important right now. They were very important before the pandemic, but they're even more important now. Second point, risk. When we're trying to evaluate risk of zone programs, it's essentially a function of the ability of the state to be able to enforce its own laws and enforce them transparently. And I'll come back to that. A third point is that more studies and more data are needed on zones around the world. And we need this data to be publicly accessible so that independent academics, academic institutions, policy think tanks and institutions can analyze this data and provide the private sector and governments with the insights that they need in order to improve zones around the world and lower risk in general. Fourth point is that missing data is data and we need to collect it. Whenever data points are missing, this is a giant red flag and they get treated typically not with the importance that it should be. So very quickly, I've talked a lot. I attempted to collect my own database on zones around the world a couple years ago, and I'm still working on trying to do that now. But you can look at this graph from Unctad. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but it's the trade and development arm of the UN. Put this out last year, 29 zones in 1975, right? In 2018, they estimate 5,400 zones around the world. Now they call these special economic zones here, but they are foreign trade zones, free trade zones, free ports, export processing zones, are counted in here in various ways. But pay attention to how from 1997 to 2002, or just think about the last 20 years, these zones have increased from a few hundred to thousands of them in a very short amount of time, which should indicate to all of us sort of where the trends are going with this, because this is tracked right along with the massive increase in global trade that has brought a lot of the prosperity around the world throughout that time. Now you see 29 countries in 1975 with zone programs up to 147 in 2018. And I can pretty clearly tell you that any of those last 50 countries that don't have zone programs established, they have them in the plans and they are coming. So if we're asking, you know, is there a dark side to free ports or to creating them? Yes, of course, there's going to be some type of risk associated with them because they are connected to a global system of these ports and free trade zones, and they're not all equally the same. Some are very, very, very risky, some are not. So there is some type of a dark side that we shouldn't go into this thinking that they're all just beautiful and perfect because they're not, but they are important and critical, as I pointed out. Now, talking about the number of zones by region, which gets to sort of what my academic research was dividing up between dictatorships and democracies, or democracies and non-democracies, who was creating the zones and how this was affecting them politically. If you look at the UN report, the most recent one, the division, if you assume there's 5,400 zones you see 374 in developed economies and 4,700 in developing economies. And so I bring this up because Freeports, the main point I want to make is that Freeports, foreign trade zones, free trade zones are essentially amplifiers of the domestic environment. So developed economies tend to be service economies. And so their zones end up being freeports, which are generally logistics hubs or other technology hubs and different types of zones like that that are more conducive to service economies, whereas developing economies tend to be manufacturing, extractive economies. And so you see more export processing zones, special economic zones, free trade zones that are more tied to shipping and production, manufacturing types. But if you want to get into the risk side of it as well, you can look at things like the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index, which looks at this. And I say this is that zones are magnifiers of the domestic political and economic situation. So I give the example of the United Kingdom, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the United States. So they all rank really high in the rule of law index. I think the UK is around 12, and the United States is 21st. The foreign trade zones, 200 plus foreign trade zones in the United States, are typically considered to be some of the best run and the lowest risk in the world. But the US ranks, 21st compared to the UK's 12th. So if I'm going by this measure, I would say that UK zones aren't going to pose the biggest risk in the world. I also bring up Singapore and Hong Kong because those are both essentially free ports themselves, which rank very high, right around UK's rank on the rule of law index. And those city-states are essentially free ports. So that can give you some sort of idea there. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you have Venezuela or Myanmar at the bottom of the rule of law index, whereas it's well known that the island of Margarita off the coast of Venezuela is a free port, and it's known to be a way station for Colombian drug lords bringing cocaine to Europe. So the Freeport ends up being a amplification of the domestic situation there. Now, on illicit trade, illicit finance, is this a threat in Freeports? Of course, it's a threat everywhere. Freeports are not. If you take any of the United Nations estimates or anybody's estimates of global illicit trade and finance, and if you counted that amount as a national economy, the illicit trade finance market would be one of the top 10 global economies in the world. We're talking trillions of dollars. So it's a threat in everything, but this shouldn't scare us away from making rational economic policy. So to conclude, if we want to mitigate risk and enjoy the benefits of free ports and foreign trade zones, I would recommend reading the RUSI briefing paper and looking forward to the transparency methodology they are coming up with. I'd also recommend taking a deep dive into the OECD Code of Conduct. I've been known to call these the SOPs for FTZs. So we need standard operating procedures for our zones and free ports all around the world so that we can effectively promote them through international institutions. There are lots of other really exciting things going on around this. For example, the use of blockchain and distributed ledgers to counter trade-based money laundering. And you can look to Senator Bill Cassidy in the United States, who's talked a lot about this and written a white paper on it. There's also this thing called the Gfi Trade Tool, which was created by this organization in Washington, DC called Global Financial Integrity, which essentially collects data on trade prices all around the world and will provide it to customs agencies or anybody else to be able to very quickly compare goods prices to look for misinvoicing or over-invoicing or under-invoicing. One thing I've promoted a lot is better signage. So not necessarily fences and guards and things like that, but more like billboards and signs. So people know where a free port is, where a free trade zone is, what it is. I think this would help go miles with advertising and just promoting the brand of zones in general. And also for, you know, countering corruption and other risk factors. But then also the treating data as missing data. It's a warning sign whenever a zone is not reporting what's coming in or out. And doing this in the aggregate, which gets to what I talk about a lot is I think we need to identify all the world's free ports and zones in a public database where we can identify them and encourage them to report aggregate statistics. And the reason I emphasize aggregate is because this protects the privacy rights of companies who obviously want to protect their trade secrets and different data, private data, individual data from bad actors stealing it and using it. Finally, getting creative, which I think Richard talked about a little bit with the virtual use. I've talked about service economies in the developed world. Services are sold to other countries as well. And so there's an idea there that you could somehow structure zones and free ports to be able to better house service economies and services to be sold outside of the zone. But with that, thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to the discussion. And I will hand it off now to Irene with the global The Economist Intelligence Unit, which has done some wonderful work on classifying zones and creating indices like the ones that I've used in a lot of my studies.
So as I was saying, I think it could be interesting for the conversation we're going to have later on, and also to expand on what Clay and Richard have so skillfully described. Really share with you some findings from this index we have been working on for the last 4 years. As I said, it's something we have launched in 2016 just for Asia, and we have then expanded for the rest of the world. We're now covering 84 countries. So basically, what I like to really stress with this index. This index is really looking at the environment in those 84 countries to enable or to reduce or limit illicit trade. And this is actually looking predominantly at the structural environment in the countries, including what the institutions are doing, legislation, initiative, and government strategy in terms of illicit trade. As you will see from this slide I have managed to put on the screen, this index is really looking at a number of indicators which have to do really, as I said, with the environment. So we're looking at government policies, we're looking at supply and demand regarding trade and illicit trade. We're looking at customer environment, and also we look at transparency in trade, which is something which is very important. And it's been highlighted already by Clay. It's really one of the key elements when we look at disincentivizing illicit trade. When we look at this category of transparency in trade, we actually look at two indicators having to do with free trade zones. This is because, as it was said, and as is very clear in the paper that Rosie has just published, free trade zones actually have been instrumental for many developing countries, also developed countries, to really attract FDI and be a enabler of economic growth. There are countries in China. The problem with free trade zone is that the characteristic of the free trade zone, which is really try to simplify operation and give incentive to companies who wish to actually establish in those zone, also open the way for illicit trade many times. So in this, for us, in this big project we've been conducting the last 3 years, and as part of this index, we also looked at 5 free trade zones across the world, identified based on their importance and also their, I would say, institutional flows, to really see and identify what are the characteristics that free trade zone should have in order to really be a positive force for the URL of where you can find all our research, which is actually available online, and there is also an Excel spreadsheet where you can actually look at the performance of each countries. And I'm going just to go a bit more in details in terms of what we're looking at when we look at free trade zone, because I think those are actually important elements which I will then distill into some kind of lessons from our research. So as I said, the free trade zone can be an important facilitator of trade and economic growth. As Clay has shown, the number of free trade zone has increased exponentially from the 80s. I think nowadays the last UNTED assessment is about 5,000 free trade zones. Majority, 49%, 45% is in China, but there are a lot of other free trade zones in the developing world, and also 11%, 10% in the developed world. I won't go more in details into that because Clay has already provided quite a comprehensive picture of the situation in terms of world presence of free trade zone. But really what we have seen is that sometimes those free trade zones actually display very important vulnerabilities that open the door for many forms of illicit trade, including counterfeit, but also human trafficking and also financial crimes, money laundering, and there are interesting the free trade zone. I mean, we have looked in this study I mentioned at 5 free trade zone. We look at free trade zone of Colombia, Panama. We look also at free trade zone in more developed part of the world, including the 9 free trade zone in Singapore, or the one of the biggest free trade zone in the world, which is the Jebel Ali free trade zone in Dubai. And what we have seen really is that in all these free trade zones, there are a number of characteristics, and there is also a connectivity that actually show us that it's not just trade is globalized, also illicit trade is globalized. So I was talking to one of our experts in terms of free trade zone, and what he was telling me is that many times, you know, you see this connectivity, for instance, from Dubai, where goods, pharmaceutical goods, counterfeit enters from China or from Africa. Those are actually then exported to Europe and the Middle East, and the money goes to the free trade zone in Colombia, where they are then where it's then being laundered, and then it's being used to finance other illicit trade activity, including terrorism. So it's really important to bear in mind that globalization doesn't apply just to illicit trade, but unfortunately also to illicit trade. And the free trade zone could be actually a perfect hub for that, because obviously we are creating, countries that are creating free trade zone are creating in a way zones where there is very little supervision. So it is important really to get the right balance between liberalization and monitoring and supervision. So in terms of elements that we look at the research as, I would say, enabler or element that can make sure that there is good governance in a free trade zone, we looked at 2 indicators in our index. One is whether and to what extent a country has adopted Annex 2 of the revised convention. This annex really look at free trade zone and list a number of the free trade zones managed, and goods actually transiting through the free trade zone are protected. The other element we're looking at is really what is the governance of the free trade zone. So what the extent to which free trade zones are monitored and there is oversight. Not only looking just at whether there is a legislation in place or norms in place to ensure this supervision, but also actually if what is the informants, is there really it's not enough that there are custom authorities in the free trade zone. Are those custom authorities really inspect goods that come in? And this is actually an important point, because you see that a lot of countries have legislation, but they don't actually have enforcement, and enforcement is once again very much important when we talk about illicit trade. Just to spotlight the ratification of this Annex D, the Kyoto Convention, what actually surprised me quite a lot is that while a number of countries actually ratified the convention, there are just 5 countries at the time when we did the research which had ratified this annex. And if you look at this list of countries which I put there in the slide, quite an odd mixture, quite an odd mixed bag of economies. But really, there are just 5 economies which have accepted and ratified all the annex, and only 8 which have adopted parts of it. The UK is not part of those, no countries in the European Union have adopted the annex. And this is actually something quite striking, because that's one of the things which could ensure really international oversight and alignment across free trade zone in different countries. A couple of conclusions from this research is that customs are very important. It's very important to make sure that there is a custom office in each free trade zone, and there is and the local there is actually an enforcement of the rules. The authority present in the free trade zone should have the legal authority to carry out checks at any times on goods stored in a free trade zone. The enforcement, as I said, is very important. Laws, of course, it's important to have the regulation and have the laws, but actually we also need action to be taken by the authorities present in the free trade zone. Governance, what we have seen is that, as in many other things, good governance is key to actually prevent illicit trade, and it's key to ensure that the free trade zone can actually act as force of good. So wherever there is corruption, what we see is really there is illicit trade. The more corruption is reduced both inside and outside of the free trade zone, the more likely illicit trade volume will fall. The fourth thing is about infrastructure. Is not to say that strong infrastructure is a guard against illicit trade. In fact, we have seen that, one of the examples we have used is the Singapore-9 free trade zones. So it's not a sufficient condition to have a good infrastructure, but it is true that weak infrastructure creates additional vulnerability in terms of that illicit trade can actually exploit and use additional loopholes. The other recommendation on our side would be really to look at this Annex T. So important, and again, I think it's very important because this actually provides a roadmap on what needs to be done, and it's something that actually ensures that there is a coordinated approach to free trade zone and illicit trade. So it's really important to sign both the revised Kyoto Convention and the Annex T, and implement the key provision of those convention and annex, including refusing goods which are brought from abroad on the grounds that the goods are subject to prohibition or restriction on the grounds of public morality, public security, public hygiene or health, or the protection obviously of intellectual property. So I may just show you the ranking from the index, just to show you also in terms of where the UK sits. So in general, we obviously, our assessment of the UK is that the institutions are in place. There are institutions in place. The government policy as a scoring of 95 over 100. Actually, it's quite interesting that the UK is actually the lowest ranking for the UK is specifically in that category of transparency in trade. So where the free trade zone actually have a role to play. So I would say it's really, I think in itself, going back to the UK's case, it is potentially a very good thing to have Freeports and free trade zone, but you have to be really careful on how you do that. And I think it's very important to have really to make sure that there are rules, there are enforcement procedures in place, and that really there is an effort to think about the possible illicit trade implication, and really, I would say, government vision, because what we have seen many times with the free trade zone is that some governments don't really focus too much. They don't seem to care too much about what goes in the free trade zone. They focus more on what comes into the national territory, and they don't really care about what is just transiting across the national territory. So I will leave you with that. Again, if you want to have a look at this work we have done, you can find it in the URL there. And I'm looking forward to a conversation with you. And apologies again for my first few minutes. And you all have seen that I'm not very tech savvy, so sorry about that. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for leaving us in such a good position to begin the Q&A. If everyone could begin sending in questions that they have, I can see a few filtering in already and upvoting those. I'm sorry that you haven't been able to change your names, but if you are able to just put your affiliation in the question, that works fine. Maybe if I can just relaunch the poll with Izzy to see if anything has changed, but also at the same time ask a few questions of our presenters, abusing my chair's privilege as is customary. So Clay first, and I'll dish out a few questions just to save time. You spoke about foreign trade zones in the US as examples of very well-governed zones. Do you think there's any specific policies or accountability mechanisms that we could adopt from that in the UK context? And then a similar style of question really for Richard, which would be, do you think that there are other practices that we can adopt from a security perspective from other UK ports that would be applicable in Freeports? And then finally for Irene, you spoke about the evaluations that the EIU performed in Singapore, Panama, the UAE, many of the same case studies that we have too. Do you see those assessments as being effective? Do you see that as a lever to push up standards or not? Maybe if we begin with Clay.
So great question. And I wish I was more in tune to UK specifics to answer it more specifically, but I can say from the US standpoint, I don't want to give the perspective that that US free trade zones are perfect because they're not. I've been studying this for almost a decade, and I've never been able to get a clear answer on exactly how many zones the US has in operation because we're so poor at reporting data on it. So it's always 200 plus, just because we don't know how many there are or how they're operating. So there are a lot of areas that the US is falling behind, in my opinion, on how we run them. But comparatively, because I'm a comparativist by training, looking around the world, comparatively, the United States is doing way better than the rest of the world at what they're doing. And that's largely a result of the processes, the separations of powers, the transparency that's inherent in a federal system as well to drag that out. So the Federal Register, like when anybody in the US wants to create a zone, it's a very long, drawn out process. It has to go through public comments. They have to be able to prove to the public that it's going to add some kind of benefit. They have to tell the public, we're going to bring this many jobs, we're going to do this, and they have to convince local governments that they're going to be able to deliver on this before the US Free Trade Zone Commission will allow them. So there's a big, long process for that. And I'm sorry, but I'm not familiar with the UK process, but it sounds like with what's going on right now, this is kind of the questions and answers, the same type of process that's going on. And this is pretty common for, democratic free countries around the world for any type of public policy. So that sort of relates into the same thing. So I would suggest for the UK, just like looking to, what has worked before for different economic policies and applying those in the zones as well.
And yes, just following Clay there, and I think, Clay, you're absolutely right. We're right at the beginning of this particular process. I noted there was a question from one of the audience about previous experiences with Freeports in the UK about why they didn't work, so to speak. One of the reasons potentially was we were in a bigger free trade area in the European Union, potentially, although, you know, some of our traffic would have been arriving from outside the EU. But effectively, also there are things available already from, as I mentioned, from the HMRC in this case, in this country, to do with the customs controls, easements, etc. But I think drawing on both presentations about the security points, and this is particularly obviously a customs element, and it's not sort of potentially as broadly relevant to the other aspects of a UK Freeport model, which may be around planning, easements, and enterprise stimulus and skills incentives, etc. Would be very much a drawing on the two other presentations, is showing that the culture, the rule of law and our security culture in the UK is fairly high. Obviously, we don't want to be too complacent because things can change, absolutely. But I would say we have a strong port security regime, you know, starting from the IMO with the ISPS code, etc., but also through to corporate security and to financial security measures. So I don't think UK ports, even if they are in free trade areas, will be able to escape from certain things, absolutely. And a new governance regime will be required to make sure that the UK model is fit for purpose. Quite what that looks like is yet to be seen, but we do have a panel, which I briefly mentioned in my presentation. That's a panel of experts and me, not that I'm a particular expert, and that panel, I think, will have an ongoing role making sure that the model is fit for purpose, and we will have a vested interest in making sure the Freeports work properly. You know, we're not doing this for the reasons of to get past security or other things. The reasons we're lobbying for this is about trade facilitation and growth opportunities. So I think we need to remember, if we're coming from those points of view, that's the reason for doing it. It's not to avoid compliance with various things, rules and regulations, etc. It's to fast track things, to improve things.
And finally, in terms of the importance of those benchmarking exercises, I think they're very valuable in the sense that it's always interesting to come up with a framework of elements we think are important to, you know, in this case, to combat illicit trade. And it's very interesting to compare different countries against those parameters, right? Because really what the end goal of that, I think it's in a way, not just, you know, obviously an index is something that is very good, is very interesting, and is very kind of media worthy. But I think the most important part of the index is the fact that it actually allows you to compare your performance with respect to your comparators, but also with respect to yourself, if you can do it, you know, over time. And most importantly, it allows you to really identify best practices across the world, right? So I think this is, in that sense, is very useful. Obviously, being a international exercise, which in this case covers around 95% of global GDP, is never going to be precise, but I think it gives you a general idea, right? And it actually gives you a general idea on areas in which you should be focusing for government and for all the stakeholders involved in the fight to illicit trade.
And we thank you for that. We have a question here from Stephen Reimer, my colleague at RUSI, which I think, Clay, you could answer really well. He asks, what happens if customs officers or enforcement around the 10 Freeports is uneven and people aren't consistent in their enforcement and scrutiny? Does that mean, from your experience in other countries, that certain Freeports may become illicit trade risks whilst others may be governed effectively? Is there a displacement effect?
Sure. Yeah, they're not all the same, and they change with how logistics changes. So I've often given the example of, you know, free trade zones in the U.S. started in 1930s with the Foreign Trade Zone Act of 1934, which was designed to help companies get around the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which were destroying the global economy essentially. But so back then in Texas, where I'm a native Texan, they created a lot of foreign trade zones along the railroads to help move cattle around the country out of Texas up through there. Well, you know, since the 1930s and the 1950s, the economy has changed now, and a lot of stuff is processed in a certain place and frozen and then flown to other places. And so zones have moved to airports and to other things. So as the logistics and the economy changes, the zones tend to evolve with them as well. And so yes, there's going to be there's a need for constant vigilance to keep studying these things and how they're changing and where the weaknesses and the strong points are. But like I said in the presentation, they tend to reflect and amplify what's already going on in the domestic economy. So that's why I love the recommendations that RUSI made in their briefer of studying the local conditions of crime and illicit trade and other things around where the zones and the Freeports in the UK are going to go, because that domestic area around there is going to have some type of reflection of what's actually happening in the zone. You know, if you create a Freeport in an area where there's already all kinds of illicit trade and things going on, then that zone, that Freeport is going to amplify those. If you build it in a place where there's not a lot of it, then it's going to amplify the good stuff. So yeah, they're not all created equally, and some are more risky than others. And that's why I call for the more data, more reporting, more independent analysis by academics in particular, because they don't have a profit motive. So they're just trying to find stubborn facts. So that's very helpful to governments and businesses and very not helpful to criminals.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to another question that we received from Dean Andrews in Bedfordshire Police as well, where he asked, well, what about the criminal economies around those coastal towns that are seen as a key kind of regeneration area, where there are lots of issues with county lines and drug trade already in the UK? And that speaks to our recommendation in the paper as well. We have another two questions which are also linked from Stephen Boxall and Professor Jörg, whose last name is incredibly long, so I'm so sorry, I'm not going to try and pronounce it. But they've both asked about the displacement of industry. So obviously one of the reasons why the UK government is trying to establish these zones is because it is a big regeneration push. It's going to supposedly bring lots of trade to the UK. Richard, you've spoken about how 10 aren't enough. Is that because of a concern even amongst the port community that there would be displacement to certain ports that if they became designated free ports?
It's in that field, yes. It's sort of in that sphere. I mean, realistically, there'll be some manufacturing operations because there'll be a lot of benefits potentially. It's our vision that there could be benefits from manufacturing close to ports and, you know, transshipment opportunities and other things. The potentially the displacement argument is one that you could say about certain activities, but for heavy manufacturing, you know, the costs of relocating factories and warehousing and other storage facilities may outweigh the benefits. I suppose it will remain to be seen. But effectively, there'll be a political point here. If you've only got 10 sites, and remember, this doesn't just cover seaports, this covers airports, and even the consultation talks about rail hubs as well. So I mentioned we have 125 cargo handling ports. There are lots of other types of ports as well that servicing offshore wind farms and oil and gas industries, etc. as well. Also, we've got quite a few active cargo handling airports as well. So if you start to add those up and then go around the country, and you would think politically, politicians will want to make sure as a UK-wide policy that there are at least one or two sites in places like Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland as well, you soon start to run out of a very short list. So yeah, the displacement argument, I think, is going to kind of be held up. Whether it's justified is one argument, but the other point about picking winners, I think, which is an accompanying point, I think very much will be an issue. And moving forward, while it may not displace existing economic activity, future development, and I talked about offshore wind as a big growth area for ports, you know, those sites may have a better offer than non-Freeport sites. So there would be concerns there. And I think government, and the other thing about the UK ports industry, it is market-led, as I mentioned earlier. So as soon as government starts to intervene and pick effectively areas, then you get into a bit of a trouble. So we are pushing for a more inclusive policy, and there's kind of several ways to do that. One is just to not have a limited list, but others is also to spread the benefits of, you know, certain planning rules, for example, and other easements, because it may not be as attractive to have the customs easement at a particular type of, for example, gateway port where the freight is just passing through. And we have a lot of that in the UK. A lot of container and ro-ro ports are effectively just gateways where freight comes in and passes through and goes off to its destination. So, but the planning easements for future developments and other things may be much more attractive to them. So, you know, let's not limit our ambition. Let's make them inclusive and not limit and pick winners.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a slightly more technical question for Irene in there as well, which talks about the methodology that you guys used in your illicit trade-related index. And it asks what you categorized as illicit trade-related treaties, because obviously that could be incredibly broad categories. So Aaron Honibal has asked whether that would also cover things around shipping and things like fisheries as well for trade.
Yeah, I mean, the index, as all our indexes are based, basically our expert work on the methodology, but also we work with different experts internationally. So in terms of sources, we use either internationally comparable sources, or we also create sometimes indicators, like in this specific case of the number of treaties. So our definition of illicit trade is very broad, as you mentioned. We actually look at everything in the spectrum of illicit trade. So we look at, you know, counterfeit, we look at drug trafficking, we look at human trafficking, we look at wildlife trafficking. So even the treaties we are looking at are actually covering the totality of that. And I think it's, I don't remember exactly if it's 9 or 10 treaties, but basically they have been selected based on our consultations with experts. And I mean, you find everything in the index spreadsheet in the model that it's in the website I have indicated, but if not, I'm happy to send you the full details. So you have my email address on the presentation.
And perhaps another one for you as well, Irene, from Patrick Neveling from Queen Mary University of London. He's talked about how the UK already ranks reasonably high. It has a reputation as an illicit financial centre. Could it be that Freeports escalate that problem? And do you think that that would also affect relations with the EU? Obviously, we've seen the EU Parliament commission studies that call for the urgent phasing out of Freeports. Do you see that as being something that will become relevant in the negotiations?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, as I said, and also as Rachel's mentioned, it's true that the UK has a solid kind of institutional environment, I would say, in many ways. That being said, there is quite a lot of, I mean, if we look at the numbers of counterfeit goods and illicit trade in the UK, it's not going down. I mean, it's always, I mean, I think the last number, I was actually writing them somewhere, I think it's the last assessment of counterfeit and pirated goods was about 3% of UK import of genuine goods, about 14 billion in 2016. So there is a problem. I mean, it's not probably of the scale of other countries in the world, but I think again, free trade zone are probably more of a safer bet in the UK in terms of their implementation and there being actually more enabler of growth rather than enablers of illicit trade. But nevertheless, I think it's important, especially now that we are actually talking about free trade zone and we have the opportunity to actually shape what they would look like. I think it's important really to look at those elements. And in that sense, I think what you're recommending in your paper, Alex, makes sense. I think it's very important to really look at all those elements and look at the governance and the implementation, enforcement of the governance within the free trade zone. But yeah, I think definitely it's something that has the potential and it's a risk. As our survey also, our participants seem to think in the judging by the survey results.
Absolutely, yeah. We've had a few questions sort of on that theme as well around corruption. So one from Jamie Cox and another from Nick van Benschoten, which I think are relevant to both Clay and Richard actually. So one is aimed at you, Richard, and says, what can you guys do as port operators to ensure that there are very high standards of anti-corruption in incoming free ports? And what role does the free port operator play in that, in taking on, you know, their own codes of conduct and upholding those standards? And then maybe Clay, if you can speak about international best practice in terms of anti-corruption in free trade zones.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think there's a tendency for people to be suspicious about sort of relaxation and trade facilitation type stimulus points, because I guess it's a break from the norm. But we have to remember that a lot of our goods at the moment in the UK are not subject to a lot of controls, customs controls I'm talking about, and other controls, because we're in the European Union. So about half our trade is not subject to those controls. But it doesn't mean they're exempt from, you know, things that would be illegal under criminal law or security measures. And free ports are not about carving out an exemption for security rules and regulations. Absolutely not. I guess you could argue that just by having a lack of other controls, there would be more opportunities. But I think, as we said before, the culture in the UK is that whilst we can't rule criminality out, we have a good arrangement, good measures. We have a lot of security force. We also have, as an island, with a lot of focus on illegal immigration and terrorism, counter-terrorism measures. We do have a lot of mechanisms and laws in place to protect the country from those, and serious and organised crime is in that. So I don't see those being relaxed in any way. And indeed, there were sort of suggestions in the consultation that's out at the moment, if you look in the detail, about, you know, quite how relaxed fencing and other kind of security measures may be. And there's fairly sort of firm, robust points from the UK government that this is not about creating kind of gaps or opportunities for criminality.
Yeah, those are great points. It's a great question. I just kind of want to start out by pointing out that prior to this, at all the events at the American Enterprise Institute, we used to make bets on how long we could go without Brexit coming up in a topic. And now that the pandemic has happened, it sort of like has disappeared from the headlines and the discussions everywhere. But I see, like I started out my brief talk with, I see this as a huge opportunity. It's a big opportunity to restructure our kind of economies and rethink sort of the way that we're going about manufacturing and distributing and acquiring goods around the globe. And I think the UK is in a very unique position right now to rethink this and build something new out of it. And that's why I'm really excited about this idea. And I hope the EU would come along to it, because like I tried to hint in there, is that the developed economies, the European economies, the British economy, the United States, Australia, Japan, India, others are sort of behind the developing world in creating these types of zones. And I think that's due to sort of just a lack of creativity, I think, among policymakers on how to structure these zones to fit our economies. And it's not sort of a zero-sum competition to, you know, put the developing economies out of business or anything like that. It's about, you know, just comparative advantage. This is competition, global free markets. And so I hope that that comes out of that. But with the question on international best practices. The OECD for sure on this, but there's really not enough on it. So there are some, I've been following the World Free Zone organization and its various iterations over the years in trying to be like sort of a business association for the zones of the world. But there hasn't been much interest in the policy world or the academic world on, wrapping our heads around what these zones are and their importance to global value chains. And so really the OECD has led the way on this with their look at counterfeits and fakes, and trying to really take it seriously and do the math and do the science on figuring out how this works. But it'll essentially, I believe it'll take the free countries of the world, the democracies, the transparent countries, and the transparent companies to come up with the international policies that are needed to be an example. And I've talked about this extensively with ultimate beneficial ownership. So I love what the UK has done with persons of significant control register and on leading the way on that. And I have testified to the US Congress several times on the need to collect beneficial ownership information in the United States, because it's all about information, right? So we need this information, bubbling up from the zones in order to make better decisions. And because right now we don't know what those international best practices are, because we don't even know how many zones there are. So if without these basic, we don't know how many firms are operating in them. We don't know how many jobs there are. We just have sort of like rough guess estimates. And without that basic information, that basic aggregate information, we can't really come up with international best practices. And then the next step after that is what institution do they go through? So the World Trade Organization has done great things with trade facilitation, but they've sort of just like dropped off the cliff when it comes to zones, and haven't really done much on that in the past 5 years or so. So I don't know which institution, especially with the era of great power competition that we're entering into, and complications with China and the pandemic and everything. I don't know which organization would put forth those international best practices. But I think the United States and the United Kingdom would make a great partnership in beginning to build those.
Absolutely. I'm afraid that we've run out of time for any more questions, but I will just briefly talk everyone through the poll. Richard, I think you're going to be pleased with these results. I think you may have moved the needle ever so slightly in the Freeport direction, is the good news. So on the first one, where we asked about if FTZs create economic benefits, the category yes went up from 85 to 93%, so a marginal increase. And then question 2 around do they create risk, down from 3%. So 99% of people, when we began this webinar, considered them to create specific vulnerabilities, whether that's from a money laundering or an illicit trade perspective. That's down to 96%. Although we have spoken very much about the risks in this webinar, so that's a slightly curious result for me that I'll take home from this. And then on question 3, where we asked, do the economic benefits outweigh the risks? So would you take on the zones given the risks that you know? Well, that's gone from 45% as a yes to 57%. So 57% would adopt them knowing the risks there. I know that we had quite a few questions in the Q&A around money laundering and financial crime, and that's absolutely something that we could cover in another session. I didn't want to put my panelists on the spot, as I know that they're not financial crime experts, but that's something that we're investigating a great deal as part of our research, and that we hope to publish much more on, because I think, as all of our panelists have kindly made clear, there is still a lot to be uncovered and a lot to be published about this important topic. So I hope you join me in your homes and thank these excellent speakers for giving up their time and for facing all of your questions. And thank you very much for attending.